Charles Dickens said that The Prodigal Son was the finest story ever told. And it's arguably the most famous story that Jesus ever told. Yet, despite its popularity, many people miss the true richness and depth that this story holds for us today. So what I want to do in this video is I want to break down the parable of the prodigal son and look at what it means and how it applies to our lives today. Let's jump in. To understand the beauty and the depth of this parable, we need to understand the context in which it's written. See, this parable is found in Luke chapter 15, and at the beginning of this chapter, Jesus is shown sitting around sinners and tax collectors who had gathered around him who wanted to hear him teach. And on the side, you have the religious, the Pharisees, who look on and are kind of jealous, and they make this snide remark that this man eats with sinners. Now, we might look at that today and think, wow, that's a good compliment, but this certainly wasn't meant that way. You see, the Pharisees were insinuating that Jesus wasn't only eating with sinners, he was a sinner. And the fact is, Jesus did often eat with sinners, and it seemed at times that he preferred their company over the company of the religious. But he didn't eat with them to participate in their sin. He ate with them to show them a better way to live. He ate with them because he had compassion on those whom the religious had cast aside. So picture this. Jesus is sitting in the middle of this crowd with these two distinct groups. On one hand, you have the sinners and the tax collectors, and on the other hand, you have the religious elite. This group has done things right their whole life, and this group has kind of screwed it up time and time again. And Jesus starts telling these stories. In fact, there's a series of 3 stories that ends with the one we're going to look at, the prodigal son. But each of these stories points to God's heart for each of these people, each of these groups. There's some truth in these stories for each of these. And so it's important that we remember as we look at these stories, these two groups. Jesus is telling this story both for the benefit of the religious and the benefit of the sinners. So let's jump in and see what the prodigal son holds for us today. As we go through this story of the prodigal son, I'm going to break it up into 3 distinct acts because I think this will help us understand the flow and further understand the meaning for us in our own lives. Now, the first act that we're going to look at is called the setup. Luke chapter 15 verse 11 opens up by setting the scene for what's going to unfold, and it introduces us to the main characters of the story. And there's 3 of them. There's the father, there's the older brother, and then there's the younger brother. And each of them are going to play an important role as the story unfolds. Now, this story has plenty of twists and turns, and Jesus doesn't wait very long for the first gut punch. It comes in the very next verse when he says that the younger brother went to his father and demanded his inheritance. In Jewish culture, typically the oldest son would get a double portion of the inheritance, and then the rest of the inheritance was divided up evenly among the rest of the sons. So in this case, the older brother would have got 2/3 of the father's inheritance, and the younger brother would have got 1/3. And this request would have been shocking, to say the least. The audience surely would have gasped. Because in essence, what the younger son was doing was he was wishing his father was dead. He was saying, I would rather have your money than you. You might as well go die. You're already dead to me. I just want your money. So why don't you give it to me so I can go do what I please? And surely the audience that day would have expected a swift beatdown coming from the father toward the younger son, because that was simply something you would not ask. But the father does something equally shocking. He obliges. He gives in. He goes and divides up the money and gives it to the younger son, and the younger son packs up his things, grabs the money, and then takes off for what Luke calls reckless living. And with that, the first act concludes. And the second act begins, which I'm calling the logical conclusion. So the younger brother, he gets his things together and he goes off to do whatever he wants. And the story is clear that this younger brother has no regard for anyone but himself. And while the younger brother is off partying and doing whatever pleases himself, you have the older brother who stays behind and follows the rules. He does what is expected of him. And remember the audience that was listening that day. You had the religious leaders who had played by the rules. And then you had the sinners and the tax collectors who had mostly done what was best for themselves. They're each represented in this story. Jesus is pulling the audience into the story. The religious are hoping that next, that younger brother who is living lavishly for himself is going to get what he deserves. And you have the sinners and the tax collectors who are holding on to hope that maybe there's still some hope for the younger brother despite the mistakes that he's made. And so the story continues. The younger brother is living in a faraway land in excess of everything that the world has to offer. But as what often happens in these cases, what the younger brother thought he wanted ended up getting him. And Luke soon tells us that the demise and the fall of the younger brother was coming. And this had to bring smiles to the religious face. Finally, he's going to get what he deserves. Finally, he's going to learn his lesson. And fall he does. The younger brother falls harder than anybody expected. Soon he finds himself with nothing, not even a bite of food to eat. So he has to go find a job, but the only job he can find is feeding pigs, which were like the lowest of the low animals in Jewish culture. This is a slap in the face. And soon we find not only is he feeding the pigs, but he's so hungry, he's eating the scraps that he's giving the pigs. He is in disgrace. He is in despair. And surely the religious listening that day, smiles would have widened. They would have got happier and thought, finally, a story of justice where good prevails, where the people who have done what is right the whole time prevail over those screw-ups, over those deplorables down here. But Jesus isn't done yet. Eventually, the younger brother comes to his senses and he realizes that it would be better for him to be the lowest of the low servant in his father's household than it would be to continue on here. So he sucks up his pride and he starts his shameful walk back home. Now, this is where the story gets really, really good. The son is walking home, and as he's walking home, he's thinking of all these things he can say to his father to convince him to let him come back into the household. And he convinces himself, if he just becomes a servant, that will be enough. And he's coming up with all these arguments and all this reasoning as to why the father should let him come back in. And as he gets closer, nobody's expecting what's about to happen. You see, as the son was still a long ways off, the father spots him. In other words, the father had never given up hope that one day his son would return. So he anxiously waits, scanning the horizon, looking out for his son to one day come back. And if that's not shocking enough, when he finally does see his son, he doesn't wait for his son to come to him. He takes off running, which in Jewish culture was considered undignified. You didn't run. So not only was this father not wishing his son was dead, he was scanning the horizon, waiting for him. But when he saw him, he was so excited, he didn't care what people thought. He took off running towards him. As the father gets close to the son starts speaking his prepared speech that he's been rehearsing for his day's travel back, but the father won't let him get any words out. And instead, he starts barking out orders to all the servants to throw this extravagant party with the finest foods because his son has returned. He gets him jewelry and provides new sandals and a robe because his son has returned. And surely, the Jewish religious leaders that were listening to that story that day, their jaws would have dropped. Who would do that? After the son had wished his father was dead and blew his inheritance, who would welcome him back like that? But the biggest surprise hasn't come yet. You see, all along, Jesus' listeners thought this was the story of the prodigal son. And that's how we read it today. But the reality is, this isn't the story of the prodigal son, it's the story of the prodigal sons. The first son, the younger brother, gets lost while far away, but the older brother gets lost while at home. You see, as this party is going, the younger brother shows up from doing his job, from doing what's right, and notices this party and asks, "What's going on here?" And a servant tells him, "Your younger brother has returned. We're celebrating," and he gets furious. Eventually, the father comes out to calm him down and explain and invite him into the party to celebrate with him. But instead of wanting to go into the party, he's furious because he's done what's right. And his younger brother has lived foolishly and lavishly. And he's upset because he hasn't gotten what he feels that he deserves. You see, what's fascinating about this story is the father twice goes to his sons to invite them into the party. But whereas the younger brother accepted it, the older brother refused it. The older brother thought that by playing by the right rules that he would get what he deserves. He too had the same heart as the younger brother. The younger brother just had more guts to demand the inheritance and go blow it. The younger brother was playing by the rules, not because he loved the father, but because he wanted what he felt was his. You see, this is the story of two prodigal sons. One who got lost by living lavishly, and the other who got lost by trying to do what is right for his own gain. And the older brother refused to come into the party. He refused the invitation to celebrate the lost being found. You see, the older brother would rather wallow in self-pity than join the party. And he even fabricates accusations against his younger brother by saying he blew your inheritance on prostitutes, which is something the story never mentioned. He's trying to make his younger brother look bad and make himself look better. You see, what we're seeing unfold in the story is the older brother is just as lost as the younger brother. It's just he's refusing to admit it. And what's incredible about this story is the same grace and patience that the father displayed to the younger brother, he's displaying to the older brother. He's not being condemning, he's being gentle and kind. He's expressing his desire for the older brother to come in and celebrate. He's reminding the older brother that the inheritance is still his. But now is the time to celebrate the lost being found. Standing on the outside of the party is the older brother, deciding if he wants to go in. And that's how the story ends. Does the older brother go in? We don't know. And I think that's intentional. That's the beauty of the story because it allows us to place ourselves in their shoes. Remember, the two crowds that Jesus was talking to, the religious leaders, represented by the older brother, and the sinners and the tax collectors, represented by the younger brother. You see, this story was kind of a jab at the religious leaders. Jesus is saying, listen, I came to save the lost, to save the sinners, to save the sick. And now you are standing on the outside of the party because you think you did everything right. You think you deserve this. But the reality is, we're all sinners. We're all tax collectors. We're all lost. Some of us got lost by living extravagant lives. Some of us got lost, well, at home. And so the question that Jesus was asking his audience is, are you going to come in to the party? Are you going to admit that you are lost and I've come to find you? Or are you going to stand on the outside? And that question is still ringing true for us today. Are we going to enter into the party? Are we going to return home? Or are we going to still live lives only thinking of ourselves? So let me ask you, who do you identify with in this story? Are you the younger brother who went off and lived extravagantly, who lived life far from God, apart from God, doing whatever you want? Because if that's you, when you return home, you're not going to find a father that wants to beat you down. You're going to find a father that wants to throw a party for you, that wants to celebrate what was lost being found. So if that's you, if you're the younger brother, if you've been living extravagantly, go home. God has something incredible for you. Or maybe you identify with the older brother and you've done all the right things. You've played by the right rules, but maybe you haven't done it for the right heart. And when you see a younger brother, when you see a sinner that has done these terrible things in their life, get the grace of God, you get a little bit jealous because you've played by the right rules. So where's your reward, right? See, the reality is we can follow Jesus, but we can become lost at home. So maybe you identify with the older brother. And if that's you, Jesus is inviting you into a party. The reality is you're just as lost, you're just as broken as that person over there. It might look a little bit different, but the bottom line truth is still the same. And the question you need to ask yourself is, are you going to enter the party? Because Jesus has something incredible for you too. But you got to go through the doors. You got to enter the party. The Prodigal Son is a story that reminds us that we're all lost. Some of us are lost in a land far away. Some of us are lost at home. We're all lost, we're all sick, and we're all in need of a Savior. And the story encourages us and reminds us that when we go back to Jesus, we get a party of a lifetime. He celebrates the lost being found. He's happy when we return to him because what he wants more than anything is a relationship with you. The Prodigal Son is an incredible story that has some incredible truth and challenges for us today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you were encouraged and challenged in your faith. If you were, would you like this video? And then also leave a comment letting me know your thoughts. Who do you identify with, the younger brother or the older brother? And don't forget to subscribe to this channel so that you can stay up to date on future content that's coming out. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.